Because you're watching this on YouTube, you're probably familiar with the GT 730. Now, picture that, but make it worse in every way. That's the 620. So what kind of performance could you expect off of such an underwhelming graphics card? And if you overclock it, is it not actually that bad? To answer those questions, I started by playing GTA with factory clock speeds to make sure that the card actually worked. And it did, but after a minute of gameplay it was running at 104 degrees Celsius. It then automatically shut itself off, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to resuscitate it. So I peeled off the cooler, which revealed what I would describe as a dusting of thermal paste. Actually, you couldn't even call it paste at this point. It had a few specks of crusty thermal compound that flaked off when I removed the cooler. But that's all that appeared to be the issue, so I threw on some new paste and put the card back together. The GT 620 was the third least powerful graphics card when it released 10 years ago as part of the GeForce 600 series. It was an entry-level card that can do little more than playback video and maybe run some Half-Life 2. Back in 2012, it carried an MSRP of $40, but can now be found for $20 on sites like eBay. So what exactly would your hard-earned money have gotten you? Well, it varies because there was actually two different versions of this card, the OEM version and the consumer version, I guess. Fun fact, but the OEM version was actually just a rebranded GT 520, and even better, the consumer version was a rebranded GT 530. Two cards with the same name and different specs. Luckily, the version we have was the one meant for consumers, and not the OEM one thrown into the Best Buy PC so it can be sold as a gaming computer. Specifically, ours is the Synergy Edition by Zotac. There were two different versions of this card that I was able to find, one with 1GB of VRAM and the other with 2GB. We have the one with 1GB of VRAM, so that's a bit of a disappointment, but you can get an open box version of the 2GB card for only $200 on Amazon. My version came with a memory clock of 533MHz, and the GF108 processor clocked at 700MHz with 8 render output units and 16 texture mapping units. But on the bright side, it does support DirectX 11, which means it should be able to at least start most modern games. The test system I'll be using today has an i3-4130, 16GB of RAM, and Windows 7 running on an SSD. Driver installation went without a hitch, so let's see what it can do. In 720p with the lowest settings and factory clock speeds, the card managed to get an average of 25 FPS in GTA. That's not great, so I ended up overclocking the card and got it stable with an increase of 70MHz on the core and 67MHz on the memory. This netted us a 2 FPS increase in average frame rate. So yeah, you could overclock it, but it's not going to save the card from its consistent shortcomings. I ran the rest of the benchmarks with the aforementioned overclock to try to give this card the best shot possible. Fortnite was the next title I tested, and it did surprisingly well. In 720p with the low settings, 100% render scale, and the performance renderer selected, it got an average frame rate of 53. It was perfectly playable, and really demonstrates how well the game is optimized. Also, it's recorded on my phone because the capture card didn't want to work with this game. Next up was Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This actually performed well, and with the lowest settings in 720p had a frame rate between 45 and 60 FPS. This is good and mostly playable, but most people would still prefer 1080p for a competitive shooter. However, in said resolution with the same low settings, the frame rate fell down to 25 and 30 FPS. This might have been playable, but it was also very inconsistent and frequently dipped down to the lower teens. So, like most of the games tested, 720p low is the way to go. Afterwards, I played some Genshin Impact, which took a very long time to download. With a 60% render scale in the lowest settings, I started off by playing in 720p. This was playable enough and got an average frame rate of 31 FPS. I got into a little bit of combat with some slimes and it was pretty stable and had no stuttering or large drop in frame rates. Then for some reason I decided to try it out in 640 by 480, which as expected did run better by about 10 FPS, but also looked horrible. Like its graphics were reminiscent of Doom 2. Remember that 60% render scale? That combined with our lower resolution means the game was being rendered in 384 by 288. Anyways, the next game was Rainbow Six Siege, which did run and did get a good frame rate, but was unplayable for other reasons. To hit an average frame rate of 32 FPS, I had to turn the resolution all the way down to 1024 by 768 with the lowest settings and a render scale of 25%. Here's a clip of me shooting a bush because I thought it looked like a player. And also the game ended up crashing really quickly. This was probably due to the overclock, but I still don't think this card has what it takes to run Siege. The last game I tested was PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. In 720p with the lowest settings and a 70% render scale, the 620 managed to get an average frame rate of 16 FPS. Not really playable by any stretch of the imagination. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, this pitiful performance didn't last long at all, and the game actually crashed after just a few minutes. So, should you get a GT 620? No. For the same price, you can get a Quadro K620 that is better in every way. Also, my card did not overclock very well. From references I found online, this one I was not able to push quite as farther, but one thing remained true across the board. Overclocking cannot save the GT 620. You can make things run slightly less worse with overclocking, but it's still going to be bad. Even CSGO, that came out the same year as this card did not run so well, and I know I tested more modern games like Genshin and Siege on it, but really, this thing's a piece of crap. Oh, and we also have a community Discord server where we discuss a variety of topics. Link in the description. With that, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed the video. I've left a few donation methods in the description below, and if you want to directly support the channel, that's a great way to do so. If you have any questions or related comments, then leave them below and I'll be sure to respond to it. While you're at it, consider subscribing or leaving a like because it genuinely helps me out. That's about it. Have a great day. Bye.